it's a great pleasure to welcome both Nura Ali and Aram Kim to Nickle at Noon. We are collaborating with Stride Gallery on bringing this presentation to you. And I thought I would just introduce Aram, who will introduce Nura, with whom she's been working on an exhibition that I believe is opening very soon. So Aram is a Korean-born curator and a writer who has received a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Critical and Cultural Studies at Emily Carr University of Art and Design. She's been involved with the Stride Gallery for many, many years and has previous experience working with artist-run centers and public galleries in Calgary and Vancouver, including the New Gallery and Access Gallery. She's also been involved with the Sled Island Music and Art Festival's visual art programming, and since 2018, she served as the director at Calgary Stride Gallery, a non-for-profit artist-run center here in Calgary. In 2017, Kim was awarded the Canadian Art Writing Prize, a commission to write for the publication that resulted in the essay, and I hope I have this right, When Oil is Our Lifeblood, published in the fall of 2018, which you could find online. And in fact, I did, and I'm going to read it. So Aram, it's lovely to meet you almost face to face and to be facilitating this program. I will stop sharing those slides and invite you to introduce the speaker.
Thank you, Michelle, for a really lovely introduction and having us here today. I've been working with Nura in the past year with also my lovely colleagues Eva Berhanu and then Cardinal McCartney at Stride Gallery. We're a team of 3. And we have Nura here today. Nura Ali is a visual artist, community organizer, and social activist living and working in Calgary, Alberta. Her multidisciplinary practice is deeply rooted in investigating the linguistic scaffolding, upholding the construction of race, and the veiled verbal and textual strategies that perpetuate white supremacy. Ali is deeply invested in strategies to dismantle oppressive structures, and for this reason became one of the founding members of the Vancouver Artists' Labor Union, a unionized workers' cooperative with a mission to transform labor practices within the arts sector and create fair, equitable, and sustainable working conditions for artists and cultural workers. Her exhibition, Black Holes, will take place at Stride from May 20th to July 8th, so please come visit us. Also, Nura is a research fellow in partnership with Stride and the Bows. She's embarking on a really exciting research project, researching and curating and doing studio visits with Black artists in Calgary and the Prairies, really hoping to create a sustainable environment to document, celebrate, and archive and present Black artists based in Calgary and the Prairies. It's a long-term project, so please stay tuned for those upcoming forms that her research will finalize in. We're happy to have Nura take it away from here.
What a lovely introduction. So I'm so thrilled to be here today to share all the things that have been percolating in my little brain for the last couple of years. Sorry for all the technical difficulties, but I'll try to keep everything brief because I know that the real meaty stuff happens in the Q&A, so I'll try and leave lots of time for discussions afterwards. So I'm not going to be able to present absolutely everything that I've been working on, but I'll just pick a couple of examples to show the main sort of like threads of where my curiosities are right now. I would definitely describe myself as somebody who is obsessed with language. And initially I thought that this obsession came about from the understanding that as people, we really formulate our understanding of ourselves and the world narratively. So the stories that we tell about ourselves and the stories that are told about us are really how we come to understand our place in the world and make sense of this like crazy thing called living. But just following I recently did a residency at the BAM Center, and I had a bit of a epiphany moment where I realized, yes, I am interested in the stories that we tell, and I am interested in language for that reason. But what I'm actually really interested in is the thing that happens before those stories are told, or how we come to understand those stories. And I had this sort of like boiling down moment where I realized that it was the act of reading and the act of writing that I'm really interested in, because that is how we come to understand what those stories are. So for me, it came about from a realization that language is really one of the last things we come to in terms of the processes we have for meaning making. And when we are, babies, before we have the ability to talk, we develop all of these different sense making processes that then once we learn language kind of takes over these other processes. And language is, especially once we learn how to read and write, textual language especially is given a bit of a supremacy that it doesn't really deserve. And that, all of these other processes that we had for meaning making are still there, but our intuitive access to them is kind of overshadowed by our reliance on the textual. So for me, what I've been trying to do is figure out strategies to be able to understand what these assumptions are that we bring to the act of reading and the act of writing, and then find ways to be able to play with them in a way that highlights them and makes them overt. So we can go to the next one. And for me, one of the main assumptions that I was trying to, one of the first assumptions that I was trying to unpack and question is the sort of assumption that me as a writer, or me as a maker, and I'm supposed to be entering into a specific kind of relationship with my audience or my reader, where the expectation is that the effort is unidirectional, that it's my responsibility to render myself as legible, as perceivable as possible. And this dynamic always felt a little bit off to me, and I wanted to figure out ways to be able to change the dynamics so that it's more collaborative and reciprocal. And the way that I did it is to start to think about it, instead of it being like writer and reader, or like artist and audience, think of it more in terms of host and guest, and how each of those roles has their own set of responsibilities, but they also have their own set of like privileges. So my responsibility as the host is to create enough space to be able to welcome people into my work. But then it is also the responsibility of the guest to be able to then take up their own labor to be able to reach their own understanding. That then it becomes this sort of like meeting halfway, and the effort flow is both ways. And one of the first sort of strategies that I use to try to do the space of like opening up is to think about the ways to be able to edit a sentence down to its core parts. And in this sort of like cutting away, I'm sort of reducing the amount of space that I'm taking up by my own definitive, declarative statements or thoughts. And I'm allowing more space for people to enter with their own set of multiple intuitive readings. And part of that was trying to realize that, textual language is only one aspect of our multiple literacies, that there are different ways, that different things that we as human beings bring to that sort of like experience. Instead of it being, my audience is this empty vessel that I'm pouring everything into, my assumption is that my audience is already full. And in that, bringing their fullness to this, then I'm also able to be surprised by the multiple readings that can be, brought to the table. And like this endeavor of like, trying to trim down to be able to create space was really exciting in one way to change how I am writing, to be able to change how people are reading. But it also made me realize that I hadn't realized the assumption that I was making about the text's own ability to be able to then perform multiplicity. So in this sort of like trimming down, I also had a bit of a revelatory moment where I realized that the texts themselves also can be enacting this multipleness. And for example, like the word mother, it now, because of all of the ways that would have contextualized it in a sentence to give it one definitive meaning, because it's been all of those things, the punctuation, the additional sort of like joining words have been cut out. Now it also acts in this sort of like ambiguous space where its meaning is relative to how you are interacting with it, whether or not you are reading it as a verb to mother or whether you're reading it as a noun really changes your sort of like intuitive and emotive responses to it. So that was like a really sort of like one of those big pivotal moments to be like, oh, even the language itself can then be doing that sort of like space creating and multiple meanings simultaneously. You could do the next one. And then the sort of like other big aha moment that I realized clarified for me one of the assumptions that I was bringing to this act of writing, because what I was thinking, what my initial sort of aims were to be able to find ways to write in order to be able to slow down a reader. But I, in that process, realized that I unintentionally ended up having to slow down me as a writer as well. And I reached another sort of like big moment of realization when I was creating this text on Illustrator, and I was going to take it to be engraved on paper with a digital engraver, and I assumed that it would have been this direct translation of the image that was on my screen to the image that would have been this three-dimensional object. But in the actual engraving of it, something surprising happened where when the laser was burning the paper in order to be able to create the engraving, it created this ash cloud that then, when the engraving was finished, settled. So all the parts that you're seeing that are blue are actually the ash that has remained as a consequence of the process. And so the digital engraver that I was initially thinking of as this passive apparatus started to act as a as a collaborator, as a subject that was adding its own thing to this process. And so that really made me step back and question my assumption about this sort of act of writing that I had assumed was me writing and creating this object. But now there's the digital collaborator added its own thing and sort of like made me realize that it could be this, like there's a new way that I could think about collaborative writing. And so I decided to restage this sort of like happy accident and see how I could use it in order to be able to push further my understanding of what it means to write. And so we can go to the next one. And so the first sort of like round of experiments that I set up to push this collaborative exchange with this, previously thought of as apparatus is I, had a piece of text that I made and then recorded it. And then the recordings turned into these frequency file, which I then turned into a hand drawing, which we then turned into our final collaborative digital engraving. And so from that process of like, switching the baton back and forth, it really, it took what would have been, if it was me writing down the sentence in one go, which would have been a very, quick endeavor. Each time that interaction happened, lengthened the process of me writing. And then it also, once the engraving begins, you can't leave the digital engraver because in case the paper sets on fire. So each one takes about an hour to engrave. And so what would have been, 30 seconds to write the sentence now became, upwards of like 3 hours. So it really, in thinking I was just trying to slow down the way that people were reading, I also had to readjust how I was thinking about my writing. So we can go to the next one. And I was also trying to, at this point, learn what were the limits of this collaboration and what were the limits of this, of the engraver. And so I was trying to figure out ways to dial in and dial up and down the ash cloud and see what kind of a different emotional frequency it took on when it had more or less of the ash. And the way that I was thinking about these sort of final images or these final drawings is that it highlighted so many other things that I hadn't quite understood before this process began, where this image now is in a sense working like a score, where it's a recording of an event that's happened already, but it's also the blueprint for an event that could happen again or be recreated. So theoretically, you could get another digital collaborator to translate these picture sounds back into actual sounds. But the new sound that would be created would be different than the original sound that created this process. So I was thinking about how even in this baton passing, that with each relay, something is added and something is lost. And about how, this act of reading and this act of writing is not a passive process, but it's one that is constantly creating anew with each pass of that relay. And then we can go to the next one. And I was also thinking about this idea of like multiple literacies, where for me and my digital collaborator, we now have a shared literacy where we are able to understand what what each picture sound, how it relates to the actual sound. But for just like a regular audience member or a regular reader, they don't have the same literacies that we do. And so they won't be able to see that and be able to relate it to its word. So they will have to go through a different process in order to be able to catch up to our literacy, but there's enough space for them to be able to enter. But they will have to go and find their own digital collaborator if they wish to be able to translate that sound back into sound for them. And so it was making me think a lot about this idea of how in the act of reading or in the act of writing, that there are all of these things that we privilege as being, the definitive ways of doing things. But in fact, those things are not as fixed in place as they first appear. And one of the things that came about for me was how there is the assumption that the point and the purpose of reading and writing is comprehension and content, but that in that sort of assumption is that when we privilege content, we disprivilege something else, and what we deprivilege is the very act of reading in and of itself as being of value, but just a different kind of value. And so with this one, in that, same thinking about like the space that I'm creating for people to be able to come in and bring their own meaning making processes to it, in taking away the textual, immediately understandable things that we're just used to, it forces you to be able to go into all of these other sense making processes that we have, that, we're able to kind of arrive at different understandings simultaneously But once we only focus on this way of understanding, we lose all of the others that we have access to. And so there's a version of writing called asemic writing, which is essentially wordless semantic writing, where there are different semantic contents outside of the text. And so when somebody comes in and views this image, you can access multiple different ways of understanding depending on the types of literacies that you're tapping into. So you can understand it just purely visually in terms of its color, its content, its, you know, all of the sort of like the cues that we use to understand things visually. You can, if you are an audio person and you've seen these files before, you can understand when there's like the different pitches, even if you might not be able to understand the exact word it is, you can have a different kind of read and a different kind of understanding towards it. So thinking about how once we take away immediately what we think of as the most important part, content, what are all these other things that open up as a result of that? We can go to the next one. And so I was also thinking about how in this act of trying to like slow down the reader, in entering into this new collaboration with like a digital collaborator, I was thinking about how to push even the ways that my digital collaborator is able to read, and how to slow down the process even for a digital collaborator. So the two previous ones are, in a sense, the most easily legible in terms of like being able to like then translate that back into a sound that's legible. But what happens if I keep pushing that legibility even for a digital collaborator until we get to the next one, where even for them, the ability to be able to read it starts to disintegrate? And what kind of a different translation process will a digital collaborator be forced to go into when it becomes harder to be able to read in the obvious ways? So this is like some of the things that I'm kind of like trying to like push how far we can take this act of writing and this act of reading too. Because even for me, even though I understand and I know what are some of the component parts to this image, I would not be able to imagine what happens when a digital reader is able to take each component part, and then, because there are like so many overlays and it builds into something more like a chorus, I, even for my mind, cannot imagine what that sound will sound like when it's translated back into a sound. So it's like, even for myself, I'm pushing how far I can go until it no longer becomes reading, or it no longer becomes writing. And we can go to the next one. So another thing that I constantly have been asking myself in this like current investigation is to think through, what can the text do when it is a three-dimensional object in space? And so what can it do differently in space that it can't do, you know, when it's like on my screen or, you know, pen on paper? And one of the things that I was trying to think through in terms of like this act of reading is, what happens to it when we are reading through a different element of our body than just our eyes? And so I, you know, made these silicone letters that I then embedded in this huge silicone thick sheet that's really heavy, and it's like a little bit heavier than a weighted blanket, I'd say. And you know, there's already been that space creating in terms of like semantic content by condensing the sentence down into its fragments and allowing people to be able to then come to their own, you know, connotative associations and what those two words, what the relationship between those two words are. But what happens to those texts too when it's placed on your body? So how are you how is your emotional and emotive responses to this text changed when it's when it's on your chest, or when it's on your arm, or when it's on your leg? And how does that then tap into other sense-making processes that you are using to be able to understand the world? And so that was kind of like one of the other big moments that I realized that the text in space can do something different, because it allows you to be able to use the other senses that you are constantly using to be able to understand what's going on, and how if the letter is on your shoulder, how does that same letter behave and feel differently if it's on your toe, or vice versa. So you can go to the next one. And so this sort of like last one that I will show you is kind of like where all of the sort of threads of the ideas, I'm trying to pull them all together. I did a piece of writing with an AI to kind of like really keep pushing this, this sort of like collaborative writing with a digital collaborator even further. And a friend of mine, her father, he was like a visual artist, but then went to MIT and became a coder, and now is working on a project where he and his partner are creating an AI that is reading text from all over the internet, whether it's like scientific journals or like blog posts or comment sections, and they're reading the writing not for its content, but for its emotional content. And so, or for like other aspects of the text that are nothing to do with its specific content. And then the AI generates these infographics as a result of that. And so he took the writing that I had done with the AI and filtered it through his AI and came up with these infographics, which I then turned into hand drawings, which then turned into these collaboratively made digital engravings. And so I was thinking about how like I'm pushing the idea of what it means to write by writing with the AI, and then pushing what it means to read when I'm having an AI read the text that we've written, but not for its content, but for its emotional resonance, emotional frequencies. And then as a result of these two different ways of reading and writing, creating this, collaboratively made piece at the end, which then, takes the act of writing to a whole new place. And then finally, I'll do the next one. And so I was trying to then combine this idea of how far can I push the act of reading and the act of writing until it's no longer reading or writing, and combine it with the other things that I was thinking about, how to activate the act of reading through the body. And so I made these large silicone paper. It's like really, really thin, and has the like such a strange tactile feel to these very, very delicate, almost like phyllo-like paper, but then that has a very sort of like skinish quality to it. And trying to create it so thin that once it's engraved by the engraver, it appears to be just a blank piece of paper until we get to the next one, until it becomes legible or activated only by your interaction with it through your body. So then really, really pushing how I think about this act of reading, where you're only able to access reading by the body, or through your sort of like physical interaction with it. And I feel like that kind of is like where I'm at now. And there's still a couple of more things that I want to think through and push even further. But this is kind of the brief description of all of the ways that I'm thinking about reading and writing right now. So that is all.